The Mysterious Deaths of Six Historical Figures by Bess Lovejoy, 2019. Welcome to Eve Top 10. You might think that dying while famous means a well-documented death proceeding from an obvious cause, but nothing could be further from the truth. Whether the deceased is an ancient emperor or a modern aviator, the potential culprit arsenic or a faulty radio, the circumstances surrounding these six strange historical deaths may never be fully understood. Before we continue, give this video one like, smash on the subscribe button, plus hit on the notification bell icon. Number 1. Napoleon Bonaparte. May 5, 1821. On the surface, Napoleon's end seems clear-cut. His death certificate listed stomach cancer as the cause of his demise. During the last weeks of his life in exile on the remote island of St. Helena, the former emperor of France had been complaining of stomach ailments, including pain and nausea. But Napoleon himself hinted something much darker than cancer was at work. In a will written 3 weeks before he died, he said, "I die before my time, murdered by the English oligarchy and its assassin." There has been some potential evidence to support his poisoning theory. In 1840, when Napoleon's corpse was exhumed in St. Helena for a more dignified reburial in Paris, the body was reported to be in remarkably good condition. In 1961, tests on samples of Napoleon's hair did find elevated levels of arsenic, leading to a few decades of fevered speculation about a potential arsenic poisoning. However, a 2008 analysis of hairs taken at 4 periods of Napoleon's life showed arsenic levels consistent throughout that time, as well as levels consistent with hairs taken from his son and wife. If that makes it sound like everyone in the 19th century was being slowly poisoned with arsenic, that's because they sort of were. Back then, the stuff didn't need to be administered with malevolent intent to get into your system. Not only was it a common component of weed killers and rat poison, but it was often added to beauty products and medicinal tonics. It was also part of a popular green pigment used in paintings, fabrics, and wallpaper, including the wallpaper in the house where Napoleon died. A sample nicked by a visitor in the 1820s survived for decades in a scrapbook and tested positive for arsenic in the 1990s. In addition to arsenic, Napoleon had been exposed to a number of other toxic substances as part of questionable medical treatments. His doctors were giving him tartar emetic, antimony potassium tartrate, which is poisonous for his gastrointestinal issues, and 2 days before he died, Napoleon received a large dose of calomel, mercurous chloride as a purgative. Number 2. Amelia Earhart. July 2, 1937. Disappeared. Amelia Earhart with her navigator, Fred Noonan, in Brazil, on June 11, 1937. Before departing for their round-the-world flight, Amelia Earhart is probably best known for 2 things: becoming the first woman to fly alone across the Atlantic in 1932, and disappearing 5 years later. On July 2, 1937, Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, were on one of the last and most difficult legs of their attempt at a round-the-world flight, a non-stop trip from Lee, New Guinea, to Howland Island in the South Pacific, where the pair planned to refuel before continuing to Hawaii. Around 6 a.m. that day, her plane radioed the Coast Guard cutter Itasca, which was anchored off Howland, to provide them with guidance. But there were communication troubles. The ship was using bandwidths Earhart wasn't able to receive, and some key radio equipment on the Itasca had run out of batteries. For hours, the ship transmitted messages Earhart couldn't hear, and her messages back to them were worrying. She mentioned running low on fuel and not being able to see land. By 8:45 a.m., ship and plane had lost contact, despite an extensive air and sea search by the Itasca and the U.S. government. Neither Earhart nor Noonan were ever heard from again. The official explanation is that Earhart's plane ran out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific. But since no one is certain where the plane went down, finding the wreckage has proved difficult. However, some researchers think Earhart and Noonan may have briefly survived as castaways on a nearby island before eventually succumbing to the elements. The castaway theory has gained acceptance in part because of efforts by a non-profit called the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIGHAR. Its executive director, Richard Gillespie, believes that Earhart and Noonan ended up on Nikumuro, about 350 nautical miles southeast of Howland, in the Republic of Kiribati. The island's location fits the line of flight that Earhart identified in her last radio message, and researchers think they've uncovered photographs that show landing gear amid the coral reefs, as well as distress calls from the castaways. Several TIGHAR expeditions to the island have also uncovered plexiglass and aluminum fragments that could be part of Earhart's plane, plus pieces of what may be a jar of freckle cream and leather shoe parts that could have belonged to a woman. To make matters even weirder, the castaway speculations also involve a skull and other bones found on Nikumuro in 1940. which have since been lost. Initial analysis said the bones belonged to an elderly man, but more recently Tighar announced that a new analysis showed they likely belonged to a woman around their same height as Earhart and most likely European. However, in 2015 forensic researchers questioned Tighar's conclusions. Number 3. Edgar Allan Poe. October 7, 1849. Edgar Allan Poe. In 1849, Edgar Allan Poe disappeared for 6 days. When he turned up on October 3, near a pub in Baltimore, he was slurring his speech and wearing someone else's suit. A good Samaritan noticed Poe acting oddly and sought help, summoning a friend of the writer's to the tavern. But by the time the friend arrived, Poe was delirious and had to be taken to the hospital. He lingered there for a few more days, racked by a fever and hallucinations, and occasionally calling out the name Reynolds. When the attending physician, Dr. John J. Warren, tried to ask Poe what had happened before he got to the tavern, Poe's answers were incoherent and unsatisfactory. Warren later wrote, 4 days after having mysteriously arrived in Baltimore, Poe just as mysteriously died. The official cause of Poe's death is sometimes listed as phrenitis, or inflammation of the brain, but there was never any autopsy, and the medical records have disappeared. Newspapers of the day tied Poe's death to his drinking habits, but post-mortem hair analysis has shown no trace of the lead commonly added to wine in the 19th century, suggesting that Poe was probably steering clear of drink at the end of his life. Indeed, he had sworn to a new fiancée to give it up. Number 4. Alexander the Great. June 323 BCE. One of the most powerful conquerors the world has ever known, Alexander the Great claimed to be a son of the gods. Unfortunately, he was mortal and died a few months short of his 33rd birthday. His final illness began during a feast at a commander's house in the summer of 323 BCE, when he is said to have developed a high fever and abdominal pain. For a few days he bathed, slept, and sacrificed, but then the fever grew worse. By the 4th day, he was losing strength, and by the 7th, couldn't get out of bed. His powers of speech failed, and when his troops asked to see him on the 10th day of his illness, he could do little but follow them with his eyes. On the 11th day, he died. It's said that when the embalmers began work on Alexander's corpse, after being delayed for 6 days, they found the body fresh and uncorrupted, a remarkable event given the summer heat. Alexander the Great was just one of the famous historical figures considered during the annual Historical Clinico-Pathological Conference at the University of Maryland, in which medical experts convened to take a fresh look at the final days of famous dead folks. Philip A. McCoag, a professor emeritus at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, is both the director of the conference, which considered Alexander's death in 1996, and the author of the book Postmortem, Solving History's Great Medical Mysteries. In Postmortem, he explains that attempts to understand Alexander's death are complicated by the fact that no contemporary accounts of the events survive, and the descriptions we have are secondary accounts written several centuries later. Furthermore, these descriptions conflict. Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd century CE, says that Alexander didn't have any pain, and that other accounts added that symptom to make Alexander's death seem as moving as possible. But other ancient sources maintain that Alexander did experience significant pain, which started right after he downed a massive goblet of wine, leading some, notably the Roman historian Justin, to suggest that Alexander was poisoned. Alexander had made many enemies, not the least with this whole "I am the son of the gods" thing. McCoag writes that Alexander also offended his fellow Macedonians by dressing like the vanquished Persians, and the latest military campaign he was planning through the Horn of Arabia and North Africa must have been greeted with alarm by his exhausted army. Number 5. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. December 5, 1791. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart circa 1789. Was Mozart's death caused by a pork chop, a sexually transmitted disease, poisoning by a jealous rival, or none of the above? The famed composer first began showing signs of his final illness in the fall of 1791. Overworked, underfunded, and depressed, he was working on the Requiem commissioned by a mysterious benefactor that July when he began having what some have described as stomach and joint pain. By November 20, he took to his bed. His body began to swell badly and emit a foul odor. His wife and sister-in-law made him a special garment with an opening at the back just so he'd be easier to change. By the evening of December 4, he was starting to show signs of delirium. His doctor was summoned, and when he arrived bled Mozart, standard practice for just about any ailment back then, and applied a cold poultice to his forehead. The composer fell unconscious and died 5 minutes before 1 in the morning on December 5. He was 35. The last sounds he ever made were an attempt to mimic one of the drum parts from his unfinished Requiem. The official diagnosis was acute miliary fever. Miliary refers to a rash with spots the size of millet seeds. But within a week, a Berlin newspaper reported that Mozart might have been poisoned. In fact, Mozart's wife said that her husband had lamented months before his death. "I know I must die. Someone has given me a quatapana, a compound of arsenic and other toxins, and has calculated the precise time of my death, for which they have ordered a requiem. It is for myself I am writing this." The main culprit in the supposed poisoning scheme is often said to be the composer Antonio Salieri, one of Mozart's rivals. Though the theory faded after Mozart's death, it resurfaced with new energy in the 20th century thanks to Peter Shaffer's 1979 play Amadeus and the 1984 film adaptation. In some versions of the tale, Salieri is said to have commissioned the requiem himself, with plans to pass it off as his own after murdering Mozart. But Salieri strongly denied any involvement, telling a pupil of Beethoven's who visited his deathbed, "I can assure you on my word of honor that there is no truth in that absurd rumor. You know that I was supposed to have poisoned Mozart." Others have accused the Freemasons, who supposedly poisoned Mozart, one of their own because he revealed their secret symbolism in his opera The Magic Flute. Others have suggested syphilis, which was an epidemic in Mozart's day, and sometimes included a low-grade fever and rash. That disease also attacks the kidneys, and was frequently treated with mercury, which would have led to further kidney deterioration and could have caused anasarca. But Mozart was a workaholic who had no time to play around, and by all accounts loved his wife Constance dearly. According to Makoak, there's no credible evidence either partner ever had an affair. A less salacious theory argues that Mozart was killed by an undercooked pork cutlet, or more specifically, trichinosis. It's known that Mozart consumed a pork meal shortly before falling ill, but trichinosis, which comes from the parasite trichinella, usually causes muscle pain, which Makoak thinks family members would have remembered and included in their descriptions of the composer's last days. Before we move on, just leave a like on this video, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Thank you. Number 6. Christopher Marlowe. May 30, 1593. The maverick English poet, playwright, and spy Christopher Kit Marlowe is said to have been murdered at age 29 after a day of eating and drinking with some friends at a dining house. According to the coroner's report, when the time came to pay the tab, a fight broke out between Marlowe and one of the men present, Ingram Fraser, over who would foot the bill. Divers malicious words were spoken, and as things got heated, Marlowe grabbed Fraser's dagger, wounding him twice on the head. Fraser then grabbed it back, stabbing Marlowe over the eye and killing him instantly. That's been the story around Marlowe's death for years, but the tale has long seemed suspicious. In fact, one of the most dangerous things about Marlowe might not have been his spying, his street brawls, or his reputed affairs with men. It might have been his religious beliefs or the lack thereof. Shortly before his death, a warrant had been issued for Marlowe's arrest on charges of atheism, after a former roommate and fellow playwright claimed under torture that heretical papers found in his own room belonged to Marlowe. That's just one of the many theories surrounding Marlowe's untimely end. Others say he ran afoul of powerful members of the Elizabethan spy world. M.J. Troe, author of Who Killed Kit Marlowe? A Contract to Murder in Elizabethan England, thinks that Marlowe used his play Edward Roman II to hint that 4 members of the Queen's Privy Council, her top advisors, were atheists too. Troe maintains that the council members decided to silence Marlowe by ordering a hit, and that they promised his friends at the dining house immunity. In fact, Troe told The Guardian, all were cleared after a short trial and granted titles and positions of wealth and influence shortly afterwards. Thanks for watching. Let us know which one you find interesting and tell us the ones we miss. Maybe we will make a video about it. If you click the subscribe button and the bell icons, you will be notified when fantastic video just like this one comes out. We have a lot more that you will enjoy.